here. I think fangirl is the word that might be appropriate. I am just such a fan. I have heard Vicki teach in various states, meaning of the country, and over many years, and she's just incredible. You are in for a treat. I said to Vicki, just come teach about whatever you're interested in right now. We're sort of talking about Illumination, and I got an email a few days ago, and Vicki said, yeah, I don't like that. I'm not talking about that. I'm going to talk about Epiphanies instead. I know that everyone is agreeable to that. So Vicki used to be the canon for lifelong Christian formation in the Diocese of Chicago, and retired to Cary about a year and a half ago with her wife, who is a supply priest in North Carolina. So I don't know where she is today. I asked and you said, I don't know.
She's in Jackson. It depends on the Sunday.
But the altar guild will need to set up for 11:15. It's not going to bother Vicki at all. She's used to altar guilds and priests being in the way.
I taught seminary forever. I understand these things.
So if you would like to say anything else. I've been telling you that Vicki's teaching a Church Next class. That's a virtual class. The link is in our emails. She's teaching about the book of Exodus right now, and Genesis, sorry.
Exodus was 2 years ago.
Yes, it's amazing. Okay, I'm going to turn it over.
Okay, I'm going to, as we do this, I have some little presents for you.
Ooh, I bet you would prefer a lavalier mic. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Yes, that would be well. So I'm not really talking, except I am talking about Illuminations. That's not literally. See, there's Illumination right now.
I can pass those out. Thank you. Hook yourself up.
Was that the rector who preached at the last service? Yes. You would have thought I hated her. She led right into this. We all know of.
I don't think you're turned on.
Okay, one shout. I'm sorry. In the meantime, everybody knows about the Epiphany, right? Matthew, Magi, the family, Herod the Great, and terrible. For the moment, is everybody hearing me? Yes. Okay, we'll get this one done. But my contention is that Epiphanies show up all over the biblical text. They actually show up a lot in our lives if we just pay attention. One of the things that she was preaching, she never used the word, but there were a series of epiphanies happening, particularly in the life of CP. On the cover of this little handout is a quotation that many of you probably know from Leonard Cohen. Epiphanies are when something happens to our default settings. We wander around calmly, we understand who we are, we understand who you are. I actually don't, I've never met you, but we know the lay of the land. We understand who we are, essentially what's happening, what the default setting is for the world, sort of, these days. But in order to get new insight, something has to disturb the system. Cohen calls it a crack. What happened to CP and to Anne were cracks, in order that allowing them to see right in a different way. That's what we're going to be talking about. I do have a copy. Pardon me. Pardon us, yes. You'd think I'd know about these things. I've used them so often. Thank you. But I forget. Anyway, who knows if we'll do all of this stuff that I have listed here. My guess is not. And you can choose next week, right? I'll be back. So if any of these really appeal to you, that's what we'll do. Or if you think about other stories, I'm happy to talk with you about any of that stuff, because I love the Bible, and I love having conversations with other people about the Bible. It's what I've done my whole adult life. Anyway, Epiphanies. We're going to talk first about Matthew's Epiphany. The thing is, if it weren't for Matthew, when I was teaching at the seminary, I used to say to students at the end of a course, say I was doing Genesis or the exilic prophets, and what I'd say at the end of the course is, and sometimes it would be the examination question, what would the life of faith be like if this book or these series of books had been lost? What would life be like? What would life be like without Matthew's gospel? If we only had Mark, Luke, and John? Well, we wouldn't have the Epiphany, because only Matthew tells us a story about the Magi riding again. There are epiphanies in the rest of them. It's just not this Epiphany. Sorry, I'll try not to shout. One of the wonderful things about the Bible is also can be infuriating, is how, and this is the quotation from T.S. Eliot at the top of the inside first page, is always, you think you got it, you're at this spot now, great, we'll go forward from there. But it's always dipping back upon itself. So this reminds this writer of this, so let's go back there. Not unlike the way, when we're confronted with something new, sometimes it helps to go back in our lives. Is there something similar? Is there something with which I can compare this and make more sense of it? So for instance, Matthew will dip, at the very beginning of his gospel, he will dip back into the history of his people, their people, and give us a genealogy. Now, genealogies are the kinds of things that I know you love to read, because they're so gripping. But genealogies are wonderful little things. What Matthew is doing, of course, is anchoring Jesus in the heritage of his people. So, and for Matthew, it all starts with our people. So it starts with Abraham. When you trot over to Luke, who's talking a much larger world, he goes back to Adam, because now we're talking about the whole panoply of human experience, not just Israel. Anyway, I'm sorry. So sometimes it dips back. I mean, Matthew again will, when he's talking about the birth of Jesus, he will remember and think it makes sense what Isaiah once said about a young woman in a time of terrible oppression conceiving and having a child, and the child growing up. I think that makes sense when I talk about this woman who has no business having a baby, yeah, Mary. And then they also look forward. You may not know this one. It's going to be important if we ever get to the Annunciations. But in the book of Daniel, God says of Gabriel, it's the first time he's mentioned in the Bible, Gabriel's going to be the one, my messenger, who will come to usher in the Messianic age. And who ushers it in Luke chapter 1? Gabe, who comes visiting twice to two different people. Okay, all right, point is, let me go back, to the Epiphany in Matthew. Now, there are, let's call them people. We're talking about groups as well as people. But in this story, there is Herod and his friends in the palace, shut up in the palace, quaking in their sandals because of the news they get. There's the Magi, who are foreigners, who unaccountably are caught up in Jewish religion. And then there's Matthew and his audience. All three have epiphanies. Some epiphanies are good news. Yay, hooray, hallelujah. Some epiphanies are bad news. Whoa, I can't believe this has happened. I am very upset about this. And some are confusing epiphanies, but epiphanies nonetheless. All three of them show up in this story. First of all, there's Herod. Now, Herod is called the king of Israel. And it's not simply, I mean, we all think of Herod. When I was the diocesan canon for formation in Chicago, one of the things I supervised, I was the go-to person for people in the congregations, including the clergy, who needed formation for anybody, littles to ancients. And I did the formation of people wanting to be priests and deacons, and then I did formation for ordained people. At any rate, when I was dealing with the littles, I just lost my train of thought. Forget about the littles. This is why I should be tethered. Oh yeah, Herod. I would train the littles in pageants to hiss whenever they heard the word Herod. Hiss, that's your cue. Herod was the king of Israel, and he didn't just usurp that title, he was given it officially by the Senate and the people of Rome. He's a toady of Rome. His job and his reputation depend on how well he administers this little backwater part of the great kingdom or empire of Rome. So that's one thing. Second thing is, he hears this news from foreigners. Another king of Israel. Who is this guy? He's already upset because he's the king of Israel. How can there be another king of Israel who was born for God's sake under his nose and in his territory? How could this have happened? This is upsetting. Then, to make matters worse, the upstart's birth is marked by stuff that's rather serious. In antiquity, these things are serious. One of them is that crazy star. In the ancient days, stars were known to act in unstar-like ways when somebody of importance was dying or being born. So, for instance, at the birth of the Caesars, stars. The birth of Alexander the Great, star. Now this guy's got stars at his birth and leading people. But wait, there's more. In the text of the Hebrew Bible itself, there's stuff. Do you remember, this would take you back probably to about the 3rd grade if you went to church school. And maybe you heard the story of Balaam, and his ass. 3rd graders love that. He's a prophet, but he's a foreign prophet, and he's supposed to curse Israel. But the ass is smarter than he is and says, don't do that. These are good guys. Your boss is a bad guy. So he has this to say after his conversion. This is also in one of our favorite, most scintillating books of the Bible, Numbers. He says, a star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. And out of Jacob will come one who is to rule. Okay, star rule. Then there's Matthew's genealogy, which says at the outset, Abraham begat, in the King James Version, Abraham begat Isaac. Audience participation, Isaac, right? And Isaac begat Jacob, yes. So now we got Jacob and that star. And then Bethlehem. Now, if this upstart had been born in any other town in Israel, it would have caused no worry. But he's born in Bethlehem. Oh my God, Bethlehem, this little tiny town. Well, they're actually, never mind. There are a couple of Bethlehems, but at any rate, Bethlehem. And what does the Bible say about Bethlehem? Well, we sang one of the hymns a few weeks ago. It's from Micah 5, for those of you who like these details. O little town of Bethlehem. And what about O little town of Bethlehem? Out of you, Bethlehem, says Micah the prophet, will come I'll stop shouting. Will come one who is to rule. Will come forth for me one who is to rule Israel. And then, of course, there's a connection to David. This is where David was born. And David is the second king of Israel, but he is renowned as, for better or worse, as the king of Israel, the best king of Israel. Now, one of the things about the first century of the Common Era, so essentially the century in which Jesus was born, Jews, his contemporaries, all had expectations about a Messiah who was coming. The prophets were full of this. There's one coming. In fact, our first reading this morning, I love it that it was the first reading. God, speaking to Moses, says, after you go, I'm going to raise up another prophet like you, and you better listen to him. So there's the first prediction. But the prophets themselves talk about this one who's coming. Malachi at the end talks about, I'm sending my messenger before him. And then you get into the John the Baptist things in the New Testament, right? So all of that is there as well, roiling around in their minds. Now, in each period of terrible oppression, and they had a lot of them, they really would long for this long-awaited Messiah. But the problem was they didn't know exactly what kind of a Messiah. What kind of Messiah are you going to be? Footnote, the testing in the wilderness in Matthew, Mark, and Luke has to do with that question. What kind of a son of God is this going to be? We've had other sons of God. What kind are you going to be? So we have the testing in the wilderness. End of the footnote. Some Jews expected somebody like David, a king who would overthrow oppressors. Some expected a prophet, like the greatest prophets of old, or a leader like Moses, or in the later period, very close to the birth of Jesus, within 2 centuries, there was a great expectation about a special kind of teacher who would lead us in godly ways. So all of this is in the mix and miasma of the first century. What's this guy going to be like? All right. So David was one of the possibilities, a new David. Now, back to Herod, he would take all this stuff seriously because in antiquity, things like signs and portents were weighty matters. You didn't just ignore them, or you ignored them at your peril. Then there are so that's Herod, who's upset about this news and has to take it seriously. In the middle, there's the Magi, who are strange. I mean, who are these people? Most Bibles wisely leave it in Greek, Magi. Technically, it's magoi. Magus, which is also Greek, which is the singular, just in case you want to know this trivia, comes from other languages related to Persian or Babylonian. And that magus, magi, referred to a priestly sect. So, okay, they're up there in somebody's organizational chart. What we know about such people is that they were trained in 2 things. One was the interpretation of dreams, really interesting in Matthew's gospel because of Joseph and the multiple James he has, hearkening back to another Joseph from the Hebrew Bible who dreamed dreams, right? Okay. And the other thing they did was watch the stars, because they understood that the movement of stars sometimes were harbingers of special events on earth. We ought to pay attention to these things. That's what we know about these guys, and we assume they're all guys. How many there were? Well, in the West, that is us, it's 3. Just take a look at your creches at home. How many are there? Think about your Christmas pageants with the paper crowns, right? We've always done 3. Why 3? The Bible doesn't say 3. The Bible doesn't give you a number, because there are gifts
gold, frankincense. And so one to carry each one, right? In the East, there aren't 3, there are 12. Presumably because there are 12 tribes of Israel, and then Jesus has got to have not 15, not 10, but 12 disciples, which is why in Acts they're so rabid to replace Judas. We're down to 11. You can't have 11, you got to have 12. So we do the lots. Well, you remember the story from Acts, yes? Okay, so the Magi, we don't know much about these guys, except they've studied these things. They're from a foreign country, and since they're from a foreign country, they are Gentiles, which is going to be a problem. All right. They're one of the many characters in the Bible who have this sort of central stage presence, and then we never hear them again. They go home another way, and that's the end of the Magi. And we hope they all lived happily ever after and told people in Babylon and Persia what they'd seen. But we don't know that. The Bible keeps doing that to us. There's a wonderful article by a guy. If you're interested in this, of course, I can give you the bibliography. But he talks about how biblical literature can be so frustrating because it takes you to the edge and then it drops you off. We want to know, like with Paul Harvey. Remember Paul Harvey? But what's the end of the story? And most of the time it doesn't tell us the end of the story, right? Okay, the Magi. I think I've said enough. Wow, we've even got a half an hour left. This is very exciting. I think I've said enough about them for the moment. Oh, no, not quite. Yes?
You never used the term astrology.
I did not, because it's so misleading. Because it's so misleading, because we think of astrology as a bad thing, and actually the Bible itself, in certain parts, in the early parts, condemns it too. We're not sure that these people were that kind of soothsayers, but more like astronomers. They actually studied stuff, right?
Is it Zoroastrianomico or something like that?
Yeah, and when we get to Persian religion is when we get, yes, some of that and divinations of a particular time. Another footnote, that's where we also get, by the time of the New Testament, it doesn't happen in the Hebrew Bible, in the New Testament, that's where we get the whole panoply of devils and Satan and fallen angels and all of that stuff. Prior to that, and that all fits within, well, pretty much within the period between the close of the Hebrew Bible and the opening of the New Testament, of the early Christian scriptures, so that by the time of Jesus, this stuff is established. But it comes from Persia. And Zoroastrianism is part of that. And they have a much more developed system of angels and demons than even we do, despite what Augustine has to say about angels. Anyway.
Does it also come from Greek?
In Greek thought, yes, there are forces of evil. Step back. In the Mediterranean world, this stuff is in what should I call it? It's like salad dressing. These people are marinated in this. What Israel is trying to do is keep away from these other infectious thoughts, right? So it's part of the reason, again, another footnote, why the Pharisees sometimes get so persnickety, because they're trying to, the rabbis call it, building a fence around the Torah, keeping it from the incursion of other stuff, not unlike the demons, as we heard this morning. That's a form of radical impurity. And as best we can, we keep them out here. But there is, in Hebrew thinking, and not in Greek thinking, this is one of the big differences. In Hebrew thinking, everything's on a continuum. So in the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is not the tree of the knowledge of this stuff is good, this stuff is evil. It's of everything in between. It's the whole panoply of moral knowledge. Yes? So evil and virtue, it's a continuum. By Greek thought, and Greeks are not alone in this, there is a real dichotomy. And we're about to get to that here. It's an us and them universe. You're either in or you're out. You're either up or down. You're evil or good. And there's no place where they meet. Hebrew thought they meet. So you just have to be careful. All right. What I was going to say is the business about the wise men is too generic a title. Yeah, they're wise, but it doesn't tell us about what. There are many ways to be wise, as we know. Yeah. And kings, well, the Bible never says anything about there being royalty, and they're not treated as royalty. So they're presumably not kings, except in the tradition. In the book of Psalms, all 150 of them that we have in our Bibles, there are different types. One little type are called the royal psalms. And they, as you might expect, they celebrate the coronation and the reign generally of new kings. And the psalms that are royal psalms are prayers to protect the king, grant the king wisdom to adjudicate for his people, etc. One of them says, "May the kings of Tarshish and the isles render him," that is our king, "tribute. May the kings of Sheva and Seva bring gifts. May all the kings bow down to him." And what happens with the Magi? Or the prophet Isaiah, that worthy from the past. And this one, we did sing, "O Little Town of Bethlehem." Now we're going to hum along with Handel. "Arise, shine, for your light has come, for the glory of the Lord has risen upon you." And then it adds, "Nations shall come to your light." There's the illumination. Boy. "And the glory of and kings to the brightness of your glory. They shall bring gifts of," guess what? "Frankincense and gold." No, not myrrh. Isaiah didn't know about myrrh. So only frankincense, gold and frankincense. So there's that in the background. Now we can thank Bede the Venerable, Bede the historian. Now we're in the 7th century of our era, for saying, well, these guys have got to have names. So he gave them the names: Gaspar, Balthazar, and Melchior. Not in the Bible. And presumably, and later lore has them one being Asian, one being African, and one being European, so that we're representing the races of the world, all gathered at the crib of this child. Now, the third segment, Matthew and his audience. Remember that Matthew's Jewish and dies a Jew. Jesus is Jewish and dies a Jew. And most of Matthew's audience is Jewish. One of the things that is a hallmark of Matthew's gospel is every time you turn around, he's quoting, "This prophet said this," or this was to fulfill what this prophet. Sometimes he gets it wrong. He'll say, "Jeremiah said this," and you search the 52 chapters of Jeremiah and you don't find it. Well, you know, he didn't have a printed Bible. This was all what he learned in synagogue school, right? Anyway, what Matthew is trying to do, because he's so excited that he believes that this baby, whose sort of life story he tells in his gospel, this is the one. And I am so excited about this that I want all of you to come with me on this journey. So he uses language and traditions and stories that he knows that his Jewish contemporaries, many of them devout Jews who've gone to synagogue school, thank you very much, that they know. And he uses those as little tapstones along the way as he tells this story of Jesus, right? Because or any of you, if anybody wants to get a message across to a particular audience, you choose the metaphors you use, the language you use, so that it's not off-putting. If you want people to join you, you're not going to speak in a foreign language unless it's their language, right? Or you're not going to, I'm stereotyping, I'm sorry about this, but on Super Bowl Sunday, you're not going to talk to most women in the group about, I don't know, percentages of yards, right? You do that with the ones who are, you get my point. So Matthew is doing that because he wants to bring these people along. So they're all Jewish, or most of them are Jewish. And he's talking, but then he inserts this magi. And the problem with the magi is they're from the east. We think of that as an innocuous prepositional phrase. Oh, well, you know, I was born in the Northeast, and many people wouldn't. I'm in the South now, so some of you might not like that, right? But from the East, that's one problem. The second problem is they're all Gentiles. In their society, of course, we don't do this at all. It was an us and them divide. So for them, the big divide was the Romans and the Jews. But even within the Jewish community, there were separations. In Matthew and Mark, you won't hear about the Samaritans. Luke begins to tiptoe into Samaritan territory, and John dives headfirst. Because the Samaritans lived in the north. The Jerusalem Jews lived in the south. So most of Judaism that we think of comes from the south. Their enmity goes back 1,000 years from the time of Solomon or Solomon's death until the birth of Jesus. It makes northern Israel and Israel look like a cakewalk, or the war between the states, which I was trained to call the Civil War, yes, of very little significance. The Samaritans I won't go through all the things that are different about the Samaritans. The Jewish Jews in the south hated the Samaritans, and the Samaritans returned the favor. So there was a divide, and it's not breached until Luke and John start talking about Jesus being a host who invites everybody. I don't care who you are, to the party.
I just want to say
yeah.
something that really hits the hardcore thread in my life, like that Jesus would invite everyone to his table, you know, and so I've not been invited to a certain table in this community, and I had a little bit of righteous, sadness about that, despite being totally Jewish and Christian and Buddhist at the same time. So thank you.
Welcome. Yeah, so as we understand some of this because we have it in our lives, God knows in this country right now we've got an enormous divide, yes? They understood that too. And one of the great divides was between Gentiles and Jews. Another one within the Jewish community that most people don't recognize is the Sadducees did not get along with the Pharisees on many levels. So in the gospel, when you hear them together, it's like, what? That never would happen.
It's sort of like Republicans, Democrats.
That's exactly what I was talking about in the Great Divide in this country. That's right. That's right. So, first of all, they're from the East. Now, the problem with the East, Israel's memory goes back a long ways. They have very few, I'm not going to rehearse the good memories, there are very few. What they've got are a lot of bad memories, and it all has to do with Gentiles from the east. 8 centuries before the period in which we are now, before the period in which the Magi were reigning, foes from the east, Assyria, took out the northern kingdom. But that's where the Samaritans live, right? Took them out, really put religion back centuries in that place, took people into exile, killed some people. It was a bad, bad period. And they reached the gates of Jerusalem, but for a variety of reasons, Isaiah can tell you about this, they were staved off. That's one. 200 years later, a worse threat comes from the east. It's Babylon. Their incursion lasted 10 years. First, they took out the elite, the literati, so the priesthood, the teachers, the sages of Jerusalem were taken out into exile. That didn't stop Israel from rebelling. The second stage was to take out the middle class. That didn't stop it. Then they destroyed the temple, the place where God could be counted on to be available to people. That was destroyed. Liturgy was destroyed. All of the promises made to Abraham, to Moses, to David by God appeared to have been broken. Babylon was a bad period, and Babylon is in the east, and there are Gentiles out there. So now we have Gentiles who come from the east, and they have the temerity to say to Jews who've been expecting the Messiah, guess what? He's here, and we're looking for him. I mean, it's one thing to think, okay, that's in our tradition. The Psalms said these kings were going to come and give gifts, and so did Isaiah, beloved Isaiah. But to have it in your face, it's one thing to be removed historically, it's another thing to have it in your face. So, my point of all this is that there are little epiphanic moments for each of these groups. For Herod, it's an epiphany he never wanted any part of. For the Magi themselves, I assume they must have been wondering about how they got involved in this thing that actually belonged in another part of the world, in another religious system. And finally, the Jews, Matthew's cohorts, who had to come to terms with the fact that people that we ordinarily don't trust may have a piece of the truth. And if that truth is real, then this is the epiphany of epiphanies. This is something we want to grab onto. Okay, I think that's for the moment. I mean, here's the trick. With whatever I say forward about any of these other places, there's so much more that could be said. But at least you get some flavor of how much a bolt out of the blue this was. One last thing I'll say about this, and actually some of these other stories, is, we know about Epiphany. Most of us learned about this story when we were children. And every blasted year, if we're around on the Feast of Epiphany itself, or if it's transferred conveniently to the next Sunday, we hear the same story year after year after year. And many of us have gray hair, and we have heard this story a lot. The thing that happens when you hear things a lot is it gets blunted. It's same old, there's nothing new there. We've lost the epiphanic moment that they had. We can't exactly get it back, except this Messiah, however the Messiah appears finally, in which guise, is someone they believed who would take them back to the ways of God, to be, as one theologian whom I like a lot calls, the practice of godding. we have all this stuff about our baptisms and we're sealed as Christ's own forever. And that's an epiphanic moment, yeah? It does. All the stuff about, I'm going to kill myself, about changes that happen, that we say theologically happen at certain sacramental moments. And the first time it happens, I think the crack is there. I remember I was brought up Roman Catholic, my first Holy Communion, and I remember that vividly. Remember preparing for it, I remember the moment, I remember being afraid I'd throw it up and then have to eat it, right? But I remember a lot of that. I remember the first time, well, I have memories of things that were cracks, that were epiphanic moments. The problem is, time goes on, and it becomes old hat, and we don't have the epiphany anymore. So, all these expectations about this guy who's probably is a guy who's coming and is going to teach us Godding, how to be the way they were at the foot of the mountain at Sinai when they said, yes, by God, you be our God and we'll be your people. Yes, and for about 10 minutes, they did it. And then there was the golden calf, right? All of these expectations about this person, a king, a righteous teacher, a teacher of wisdom, a new Moses, and God sends what? That's absurd. And it must have been absurd to them, and yet it's glorious good news. It's absurd that we commemorate Jesus coming in diapers. It's absurd, and yet we in the Christian community believe that. That's one of the original cracks. Okay. Let me at least get into one more, and that's the Annunciation. Again, this is a thing we think of as one Annunciation. It's in Luke 1, and it happened to whom? Yeah, don't be so timid. To Mary. Right? 6 months, the angel Gabriel came to a town in Galilee, etc., etc., etc. But if you open your Bibles to Luke 1, generally on one side of the page, and on the other side, this is Mary, and over here is Zechariah. Same thing happens. A messenger of God, it's often translated angel, fine, comes. Whenever, in the whole Bible, whenever a messenger of God comes calling on somebody who either wants to have children or is destined by God to have children, but something's wrong, like they're Ancient of Days, or they're not married, and a messenger of God appears, guess what's going to happen next? The messenger of God comes, almost always says, don't be afraid, which leads us to the question, what did these characters look like? They are not the Renaissance angels, with the floaty big wings and etc. And then they announce you're going to have a child. And then they tell them what the child's name is going to be. And then they talk about the child's future. That's an Annunciation. And it happens from Genesis a couple of times, through Exodus, through the book of Judges, and it ends up, the last two are right here on these facing pages of Luke's Gospel. And one of the striking things is that in many ways, it's the same. It's really right. The messenger shows up. He's got a wife who's barren. Oh my goodness. Do we know of anybody else who was barren and didn't have a child? Well, you can't be a matriarch in the Hebrew Bible unless you're barren. It just doesn't work. So we have all the matriarchs, starting with Sarah, having babies. And they're old. Anybody else old? Well, yeah, Abraham and Sarah. And they too are righteous and walk before the Lord. And now it's not as immediate as the narrator tells us about Zechariah and Elizabeth, but as you follow the story of Abraham and Sarah, it's very clear that they're doing those things. And then there's a clue in the names. You know, somewhere along the line, you must have learned that biblical names are not just biblical names. Oh no, we couldn't do that. This is the Bible, right? These things have meanings and they're really important. So for instance, David, the root of David is lover or oven, because ovens are hot, lovers, right? And so on. Anyway, Zechariah's name is actually a sentence in Hebrew. Anyway, what it means is the Lord remembered. Now, in the whole Hebrew Bible, whenever it says that the Lord remembered and the direct object of that concatenation is a woman, she's going to get pregnant. It happens every time. So daddy's name implies a birth is coming. Her name means the Lord, no, El, so it's God has sworn an oath. So a baby's going to be born because God has sworn an oath. You put those two together, and before we see any angels showing up, you sort of know what's going to happen, right? And then there's the great contrast between the two. He is a male in great standing. He's a priest. He's in a capital city. He's in the temple, for God's sake, when this character comes calling. She is in a backwater. I mean, Nazareth isn't even on any maps in the ancient world. It's so small, right? She's there. She's just this kid, presumably, we don't know how old she was, but if she's of marriageable age, she's in her teens or very early 20s. She has no lineage. He has a lineage. He's in the priestly family. Neither of them expect birth narratives. But out of the blue comes, you're going to have a baby. He says, he says, how can it happen? She's going to say, how can it happen? He's going to say it because he's talking about practicality. No, he's talking about possibilities. We're too old. I mean, biologically, this isn't going to happen, except he obviously hasn't read his catechism because it's happened before. She is asking about practicalities. How is it going to happen because I'm not yet married? She is betrothed. That's another whole issue. At any rate, he, for his troubles, gets to be mute for a while, but the boy's name is going to be Yohanan. John. Yohanan in Hebrew means the gift of God, or God is giving. Her son's name is going to be Jesus, Yeshua, or Yeshu, of Isaiah fame, Hosea fame, Joshua fame. All of those words have at their center the verb to save or to redeem, right? This kid's going to be good. I mean, look at the concatenation of things that he's going to do, but this boy's going to be better. He's going to be Son of God. And yes, you've had lots of other sons of God, but this is Son of God with a capital S, right? And better than David. Yes, there's a David connection here, but unlike David's monarchy, which didn't last, this one's going to last forever. Again, talk about epiphanic moments. I mean, this would have put anybody. What kind of news is this? It's certainly startling, unsettling news that we're going to have a baby when we're essentially at retirement, and I'm going to have a baby which could get me killed in this culture out of wedlock. Yeah? But God is promising also to be with both of these boys. So even though the Annunciations, all of them, are not called epiphanies. In fact, at their root, that's what they are. Now, next week, we'll do a few more, and if you just take a look at them and see if there's one that really strikes you. I know one's in Hebrew, just because you ought to see what it looks like. It's very pretty.
Thank you. There's never enough time, except there is, because Vicki will be back next week.
Thank you all.